thanks everyone for joining in. It's interesting to talk about retention. It's a subject we feel very, very strongly about. I do sometimes have a tendency of going very fast, so please feel free to kind of pour in within the chat that guys go slow or whatever. Any topic that needs diving deeper, I'm happy to do that. The intent is to make sure that all of you guys understand the subject well enough, and it's highly relevant to most companies, as I would imagine. And hence, we feel that the more you know at the top level about how this has to be done better, the easier it will be for you to build teams and build processes around making this happen. So here we roll. As we speak about retention, just a basic stream of topics that we'll go through today. Why should you care? What are the key terms that are used in this industry which are should be familiar with? The CAC, what is CAC, what is GMV, what is contribution margin? The data story is primarily about how do you get all the different pieces of data to stitch together at one place. What are the different channels of communication? What is personalization? What does it translate into? How do you bring the whole thing together? So these are normally the terms that you would have heard or seen being spoken about at different places. I'm going to hopefully demystify some of them for you today, and you can start to make sense of how the action plan here on would look like, right? So very simply put, I'm sure all of you know the primary school problem where you have a bucket being filled at a certain rate and it's also getting emptied because of a few holes at a certain rate. Now, the filling rate is slower than the emptying rate, but the bucket will never fill. And if the filling rate is faster than the emptying rate, the bucket will fill up. But again, you'll continue to leak, right? So it'll go empty again if you stop filling it. So it applies to the whole story of acquisition and retention. So when you as a company, as a founder or as a marketer, you're trying to acquire new customers using paid media, you're spending on that every month. And a bunch of those customers keep leaking every month because they don't become active, they don't repeat with you. And that's where it translates into a challenge. Right. And as a company that wants to become big meaningfully and also to keep your ROAS in control or your ACOS in control, you will want to make sure that there is a portion of customers which is coming back without any spends either. And that's where we talk about retention. It essentially boils down to getting the existing people back. So I like to position this as a treadmill wherein you're spending a certain amount of money every month. And the chart that you have on your screen, just understand the basic structure here. The first month, you had 100% of people transacting. Out of those, second month, 20% of them transact. Third month, 10% of them transact. The fourth month, you've lost all the customers that were acquired in the first month. And that's it might sound a little alarming, but that's a reality of a lot of our businesses, especially in the age where you have a lot of competition, you driving aggressive mobile app install campaigns or newer customer acquisition campaigns with all sorts of discounts and vouchers. It can actually get very, very difficult to keep people coming back. So what's happening here is every month you're spending $100,000. You're acquiring 10,000 customers at a $10 CAC. From there, you're retaining that 20% to the second month, 10% to the third month, and 0 for the fourth month. Now, if you see the total user, which is the active base that we are talking about, which is the one that's transacting on a monthly basis, at the third month, it's stagnating. And this is despite the fact that you're spending $100K dollars to acquire new customers. So whatever is coming in from the top is actually leaking out from the bottom. So the bucket of active customers is not really getting filled up. Right. And that's where you have to remember and be very cognizant of whatever you're doing in terms of your acquisition efforts, that you have a clear track of your retention, because otherwise your spends will continue, but your growth will stop. And you can imagine, as all of you being early stage startups, I hope mostly, when you go to an investor conversation, you cannot demonstrate growth. That's one of the hardest positions to come out of. Right. Hence, to be cognizant about retention from early days will always hold you in good stead. Let's break a few words down. Very simply, the customer acquisition cost is all of the money you spent in paid advertising and the number of customers you acquired from there. That's as simple a definition it can be. It gets more nuanced as you mature as a company. But for now, just for the purpose of today's conversation and your initial few months of putting this number in perspective, just think of all of your Google and Facebook spends predominantly, and maybe some affiliate spends, as the source of customers, and what kind of CAC did you spend on getting those on board. Okay. The GMV, I'm guessing, is a very familiar term by now because of the level of usage it's being powered by Flipkarts and the likes. All the material that you have sold, the MRP value of it. You don't actually calculate discounts. In some cases, in marketplaces where you don't have your own revenue, which is linked to GMV, it'll end up being a very different equation. So Swiggy would probably be doing a GMV of billions of dollars, but their revenue will end up being just a small percentage of this number, because that's the commission or take rate that they charge. So this is a familiar term. If anybody has questions / doubts about these, please feel free to raise, and you can also unmute and start talking. No problem with that. but I'll move faster through this. This is a term that some of you somewhat familiar with e-commerce accounting would have known this better. Very simply, the contribution margin one is if you bought a product at 100 rupees, bought as in you as a company bought it X factory. So if you're a D2C company, your factory would bill you this product at a certain price, and then you're selling it to your customers at a certain price. So between these two is where the gross margin comes in. So the gross margin ends up being the contribution margin one. The contribution margin two is where, so by the way, in your gross margin, you would ideally want to take away the discounts. So the sale price is the MRP minus the discount, right? And the CM2 is where you would get the fulfillment cost also reduced, which means if you spent, let's say, on a 300 rupee piece of cake, you spent the manufacturing cost at 50 rupees and you spend logistics cost at 50 rupees, then your CM2 would become the 300 rupees minus the manufacturing cost minus the logistics cost. Yeah, so that's what you would play with. And that's your contribution margin too. So what typically you would want to build over time is the sum total of this contribution margin, which becomes your lifetime value. And that's where the definition goes. So CLTV/CLV, that's the common term that's used. You would hear this often at a lot of places. And I will let this screen be with you for a moment so you can let this whole information flow. This is just numbers, so I don't have to read them aloud. And of course, you'll get a copy of this presentation as well as this video. So don't worry about writing or whatever. What you're essentially trying to do here is once the customer has come on board, he's contributing a certain margin with every transaction he makes. Maybe the first transaction contribution margin was negative because you gave him a lot of discount. But over the next bunch of 4 or 5 or 6 transactions, you will want to make up for this. Right. And that's where when the consumer places a bunch of such orders, he delivers a certain level of lifetime value. For a e-commerce business or for most businesses, as long as your lifetime value is substantially larger than your acquisition cost, the one that we just discussed in the previous slide, you have a business which is scalable. If your lifetime value is substantially lower than your acquisition cost, then you're still burning money on every customer. Even though he'll spend more time and money with you, you'll not be able to recover that. And that's I would say, death hole where you will never be able to recover from. So that's the most important thing to keep in mind when you're scaling up. Somebody had a question? So the question that
hi, Ankur.
Yeah.
Yes, hi. So quickly on the last slide, this is Rishit Sangvi. Before that, when you say CM1, shouldn't the manufacturing cost be considered as a part of the product cost? So I come in from a food kind of a food industry.
Sure. So that's the cost price, right? So when you look at the sale price, that's the MRP minus discount, and cost price is your manufacturing cost, X factory.
X factory, including raw materials, right?
Yes, so including everything. X factory means if you take the conversion cost also included and the raw material cost also included, packaging cost also included.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. So food industry, this is pretty straightforward. I think some of the other industries it might be a little convoluted, but food industry is very straightforward. Okay, so the CLV concept I'm assuming is clear enough, and I'll move on to looking at how do you check whether you have the right level of lifetime or not. What tends to happen is the customer, a whole bunch of them, will not last the first 5 orders that you need them to last. A whole bunch of them will leave before the first or second or the third or the fourth order. And that's the part you need to be very cognizant of. Yeah. So cohorts essentially is a common term. Again, you will hear across a lot of investor conversations as well as in your internal reviews, hopefully, that what will happen is if you acquired a bunch of customers in January, how did they respond in the month of Feb? How did they respond in the month of March and so on is an important metric to track. So if you're doing a good job with improving your cohorts, you will start to see the outcomes in the cohort charts that you draw, that there are more people coming back compared to what they were earlier. And if you don't fix this well, that out of 100 people who were acquired in January, if let's say 25% or 30% are only coming back in Feb and then 10% in March, you have a dying business. It's going to be very hard to scale this or justify this. But if you're able to say that, okay, with whatever set of people that I acquired, I have a substantially large number of them coming back every month. That's where it becomes interesting because your cost of new user acquisition will always get justified by the number of existing customers that are repeating. I hope you're able to see the connection between these things in terms of more customers coming back automatically means your ability to spend more on new customer acquisition goes higher because your lifetime value is higher, right? So if I have, let's say, 1,000 rupee lifetime value, I could spend all the way to 600, 700 rupees on acquiring a customer. But if I have a 200 rupee lifetime value, I can only spend up to maybe 100, 120 on customer acquisition. So automatically my ability to scale acquisition also gets compromised. Yeah. So here we're talking about cohorts. The idea is cohorts is just a group of people. Now, all the people who are acquired in the month of January, let's look at that as a cohort, right? And you're looking at food businesses or any kind of B2C play, the interplay between categories of acquisition and channels of acquisition will be very interesting. You'll start to see some funnels which can actually scale up well, that people who are coming in from Facebook to buy, let's say, pickles from me, are the ones who tend to repeat the most often, vis-a-vis the people who come in from this Google display campaigns and they're buying shoes from me. Now, of course, not all of you will have a very wide bunch of categories, but if you're able to dig through this data, you'll start to see which products are actually the best ones to advertise more with, which are the ones which you should not advertise, and at what point do you start expanding catalog. Because what tends to happen often is, as a company, you will start with 5 products maybe, and you'll want to quickly expand to 20, 30, 40, and the inventory can start to be a pain. Right. So that's where the organic path on how do you expand category or catalog portfolio is something you should look at your repeat patterns and judge. Now, we'd happily do another class very detailed on cohorts as a subject itself, as to what are the different cohorts you can look at and how do you assess. But what tends to happen really, if you start to study these cohorts, is, for example, you'll want to understand if the average order value of your customers that you acquired in the month of Jan is actually getting better in the month of Feb or not. So if he started with buying stuff worth 1,000 rupees from you in a single month, now is he, or on a single order, is he buying worth 1,500 rupees in the second month? And this would likely mean that he's repeating with what he bought, plus he's trying a new category as well, right? Or he's buying more of the same stuff because his consumption frequency of the same category is increased, right? So that's where for the category penetration, also, if he's got one category versus 2 categories, each category has its own repeat cadence. So for instance, I might buy milk every day, but I buy ghee, let's say, once in every 1.5 months. Now, if you are a business which is in the consumer space, you would ideally want to have a few milk-like products in your system wherein the customer would automatically, naturally repeat often. Now, if you have a product which is, let's say, protein powders, and you're repeating once in 6 months with that because the 5 kilos box was sold, then you have a very little chance of being on the recall value level high. The customer would probably forget you unless you have a very strong product which has driving loyalty. Otherwise, it'll give you a bit of a hard time, right? And that's why you choose very carefully that, whoever came in to buy butter for the first time is also being steered towards milk. If you do that very well, you'll start to have more people buying milk from you who keep buying it every day or every alternate day. And some of these people will also start to buy the additional products, right? And that's where you'll see all these people like Big Basket got interested in the BB daily business. Swiggy started to get interested in the super daily business. And everybody wanted to be in that everyday frequency, the toothbrush use case. So in your product category, in your ecosystem, what is that you can do will ultimately determine how fast and how aggressive should you play on your own Shopify playbook. Yeah. So let's come back to our treadmill.
Ankur, I had a question here. This is Harsha from Real Goodness. Yeah. Sure. I run a kids food and nutrition brand. So we are largely into impulse snacking categories. Okay. Sure. So the exact question that you mentioned, the slide that you brought up earlier, which is, while a lot of our consumers may buy a product from us on our Shopify website, but ultimately there's a leakage to Swiggy, Instamart, Big Basket, etc., etc., and we're not able to measure what's the extent of leakage or what's the customer lifetime value because you're not able to measure these cohorts.
Sure.
So I think maybe sometime during the call or sometime during the discussion, is there a way that we can actually measure the lifetime value across different platforms? Because that's a major concern for a brand like us.
Honestly speaking, there's no straight answer to this, because when you have presence across multiple sales channels, what tends to happen is you'll have a smaller percentage of customers who are staying with your platform entirely. Now, as a business, what you will do is do your math on the part that's on Shopify. You'll not be able to build the entire math on what people are doing on Swiggy and what people are doing elsewhere. But within those places as well, when you have Instamart point of sale as a unit, if you're able to establish that with this store itself, my week-on-week sales are increasing, you start to analyze that number more effectively. So if your 80% of the customer interaction happens outside of your platform, it's going to be hard for you to have a very clear defined cohort and define that piece. And if you're in a product category where you have 10, 15 products, or maybe not more than that, it might be wise to not overspend on your Shopify store either, because over a period, you'll want to build a certain loyal base with that. And well, of course, it means MAUs that you will have via WebEngage would be smaller, but as a business, it's better for you to allocate this over a period of time that now I have a large enough portfolio to make sure that people stick with my platform instead of buying me elsewhere, because this is where you have the highest margins, right? At the same time, a discovery would happen across different places, the second, third, fourth order can start coming on your own platform. Yeah.
Sure.
Ankur, we have one more question from Aradhana.
Sure.
Question is,
Hi, Ankur, actually, sorry, I'll just talk about it.
Yeah, go ahead.
So basically, we're in the business of footwear. Now,
Okay.
one customer, she's not going to end up buying, footwear every month, which would increase order value every month.
Of course.
So how do you judge what the time period would I have to judge to understand the order?
So footwear is generally considered the category which has the lowest repeats as such. So of course, at the catalog level, you want to expand into other stuff like accessories and all. That's a call you could take. But within footwear, one of the things that could also be looked at in terms of within, let's say, women's footwear, you will have the categories of casual flip-flops versus the slightly higher end stuff, wherein you would have people crossing over from buying this to buying that. And again, like the category of the kids' food that he mentioned, you might see a larger amount of traction in a one-time transaction base. So that would mean from your acquisition efforts, you will want to make sure you're not gross margin negative in the first transaction because you'll not have the lifetime value to cover for it. Right. So in terms of the time frame that you would keep in mind for this can be anywhere between 6 to 9 months as well. So you don't have to get people back on the first month. But if somebody is so loyal to your brand that he'll come back to you after 9 months is a hard stance to make. So that's where you would ideally want to get into a situation where now she's buying shoes for herself, but next she's also buying for her kids, perhaps for her family, perhaps for her mother, and so on. So that's where your cross-sell efforts would go. So if she's bought a high-end pair of shoes, move her to flip-flops, move her to kids' shoes or whatever. I mean, you depending on your understanding of the audience persona.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
So this is where the ouch moment comes in, where now you understand CAC, you understand GMV, you understand acquisition, and you realize that at the end of the fourth month, you're acquiring customers who are not coming back. So you're not growing as a business, and that's a challenge. So you should be very cognizant of this across all of your businesses, right? Okay. So the key challenge which most people tend to underestimate is you're really so obsessed with acquisition-led growth that you want to get new customers in. You're spending all that money on social media, on Facebook, and
Ankur, sorry, one
Google.
question.
Sure.
If you don't mind. So you mentioned about the whole idea of being positive on the net customer acquisition cost if your product value is quite low, right? If you don't know
if your product repeat rate is very low, not product value, correct. But if the repeat frequency is only once in 9 months, then I mean it's kind of like how the holiday industry operates.
Correct.
You'll go once a year.
Yeah, and so for newer brands, right? And this is where some of my struggle comes in. For newer brands, for you to assess that, it takes you a sustained amount of advertising and time to be able to arrive at that, knowing what that lifetime value is. Sure. Because in commodities, it's even more challenging than in. So for example, honey today is a commodity, right? So most people are not brand loyal yet in India.
Sure.
Now, when that sort of situation is at play, what would you? I mean, is it better to take a lower lifetime value into context and hope that you then advertise, you use less money on advertisements, or is it better to assume a higher value and advertise at least in the first 6 months? How long is that gestation period? Probably that's my short question.
So it's a hard question because there's no straight answer. It'll vary across categories. So for instance, if I were to zoom into honey as a category, now the fun fact that you can do in the initial period when you transition from a very individual owner-led customer ecosystem where you know pretty much half of your customers to a systematic growth plan where you're spending on marketing, what you would love to be able to establish is this is the audience persona that does well for me. So people who've come in from a certain funnel, from a certain geography, from a certain set of ad messaging, and they have a repeat pattern which works. Right. So you speak to these customers and understand if they have a use case which is very obvious to your category, that they probably want to switch away their kids from sugar to honey, for example. And they have this use case for which they would buy every week a certain quantum, or they'd buy for a month because they like the ability to carry it around. Right. So that's where if it's for a consumer business, you will want to identify the user group that's most interested in your offering. And ultimately, you want to find the cheapest way of getting to maximum such customers who will repeat the most often. right? Because not every business will become a massive unicorn, because there's a certain size of market and a certain size of category for which this is relevant. So it'll become a perfectly relevant, interesting, profitable 100, 200 crore, 500 crore business, may not be a unicorn. So what you need to identify very well is the audience that is the most valuable for you, which is, and how do you get to them at the lowest cost, right? Does that somewhat answer?
All right. Yeah, partially, but yeah, no, that's good. I'll pick it up offline with you.
Sure, happy to do that. So that's where if you acquire a whole bunch of customers and that's working well for you, a lot of customers will not come back. So it's not exactly the time you want to celebrate. Now, this is where I try to introduce a little bit of lighthearted humor into our conversation, because what tends to happen with some of these long sessions is it can get really dragged and too much information too quickly. But the idea here is that when you've acquired a new customer, I would strongly recommend understanding this space like really well. That as to what is it that you already know about that person. And you'd be surprised at the amount of information that's available about these people simply on your basic analytics tools as to how much time did they spend browsing before they bought something. Have they come to the website for the first time today and after that they came back after a week to buy something? Or was it exactly an impulse purchase wherein he came in for the first time, he saw something that he liked and he transacted quickly? So of course, this would vary across categories. Honey customer might still buy on impulse. A shoe customer might take longer to convert, because people will have, let's say, you want to share them with somebody, or they want to have a second thought on whatever. So people will have their own behavior patterns. But once you understand these behavior patterns, you will start to uncover some degree of insights around who this customer is and what his preferences are. And accordingly, is this the right guy for me to scale up? And that's something that you should be very watchful of in the initial days. And that would translate into having a good setup on your GA as well as your WebEngage on the event side, in terms of what are the paths users are taking and how much time it takes to kind of convert from the first click to the eventual transaction. So what typically I've seen across categories in fashion, now it may not be necessarily true for all categories, but the number instead of 7 days could be a 7-week figure. But what tends to happen is customers would tend to develop a bit of brand loyalty, and in some cases, if the brand messaging is strong enough and the user's attachment with the proposition is strong enough, you'll start to see a very high engagement level and conversion. This is like the ideal customer profile in the perfect universe. What tends to happen typically in real world is most people will flirt across with multiple brands, but at the same time, they'll have a certain affinity to a certain brand. Now, as far as some categories are concerned, they have a natural loyalty factor that I'm doing this out of habit. I'm not going to change this habit unless something substantial happens. And this is probably the truth of, let's say, something like a toothpaste, wherein I have a certain brand that I consume. When I go to a store and when I go online to replenish it, I don't think twice as to what the brand I'm going to choose is. Right. So if you're able to get to that spot for even a small set of customers who are going to be sticking with you as a matter of habit, that is what I would call as a lifetime tango. The other one, I described it as a prison escape because you've cajoled and convinced me to buy your product for the first time by doing whatever offers and excessive discounts. But I mean, whatever happened, I'm not coming back to it. Right. And that's the part which you need to be very sure about. How do you make sure that the experience of the user in the first 7 days is as optimal as it can be? And this is about pre-order, during order, post-order, the entire journey. And the communication you send from there as to how do you move him from the first to the second order, and how quickly and how effectively can he become an active loyal customer. Yeah. So that's where the choices that you make in terms of the amount of messaging you're doing, the kind of messaging you're doing, can become a big breaker here. So for instance, if you've got permissions to send in emails or push notifications or any of that, then you accordingly utilize it tactfully. If you do it too much, too quickly as a blast, this guy will block you off and probably uninstall your app as well if you have one, right? But on the other side, if you're doing something which is more relevant for him, because all of us as customers, we probably grew up in the 90s, and maybe some of you would be growing up in the early 2000s. The amount of attention used to spend on any media was a lot larger than what we do now. On all of our phones, there are probably 20 apps which keep sending us notifications. Half of them are not relevant, so we probably switch them off and block them. But the ones that do a good job at this still kind of manage to get us to click that notification and go to the application as to, doing an engagement with the app or transaction. Yeah. So that's where it gets interesting, and that's where you need to be careful about how and what you do with your audience that's been acquired, because you will want to make sure that this guy comes back within a certain time frame. So in the case of shoes, for example, one of the ways of engaging people might just be to get them to post on Instagram what they've bought and incentivize them in some fashion with some sort of visibility on your homepage, for all I know, to get that to happen. Because the moment the user is somewhere testified as a loyalist to your brand, they end up becoming a little more attached to repeating with you often or being an ambassador for you. So those are things that you might be able to do, which are not necessarily part of your straightforward product play, but as a community play, you could start doing that. So that's where what we call as a little growth loops. A mature company like in the edtech space that we know of has about 100 odd growth loops running on our platform. In our WebEngage ecosystem, you will see them as called journeys, and within that there is a bunch of these terms that I'll go through. So wherein the most appropriate message that you can send to a person is the one that utilizes all the information you have about them. Now, you've all seen Google and Facebook use a lot of your personal information to show us the most targeted ads that you can see on their platform. It automatically translates to better click-throughs. So the level of data that you have available and how far can you use that to make a very relevant and very timely message for me is the most important thing here. Right. So, for example, in a category, let's say of food, where you have a certain repeat pattern, and by now you know that I have two kids in my family, one of them is 5, one of them is 7, and with this, you would want me to repeat at a certain frequency that I'll buy this something or the other every 3 weeks. Now, if you were to make sure that you're not spamming with all sorts of messages between week 1 and week 2, it might just work easier for you. Your messaging will get a lot more salesy by the end of the 3rd week, ideally, right? And this can be different numbers and different frequencies, but that's why your ability to use data well to my experience, to optimize my experience, becomes handy. And that's where journeys come in. That for somebody who's bought a product on day 1, what is the journey that you will send him? That you will not send him on a very aggressive salesy push on day 2, 3, 4, and 5, but you will send him on a slightly easygoing pitch for the first week, slightly intense on the second week, but really intense on the 3rd week, something like that. And this can be multi-channel. So when you go through a simple channel like an email, you will have a certain open rate. But then you can use web push, you can use WhatsApp, you can use SMS. So all these different channels are available to orchestrate as a single journey as to how intensive it can get in terms of the attention span being charged, taken from the user, as well as the intensity of the messaging or the offer. So sometimes people at the end of the 3rd week will transact, and that's fine. That's great. They've transacted without an offer. But maybe you will want to send them, let's say, a 5% coupon or whatever at the end of the 4th week that, if you're still eyeing this product and you haven't bought it, maybe let me just kind of create that little incentive for you to do it now. And generally offers would work well when they're time bound, right? So on the platform, when you configure all of these pieces, you will have the user data, which is everything that you know about the user, his PIN code, his city, his gender, all of that pieces of information that becomes part of user data. The events data is the activities that the user has done on the platform or on your website rather, right? Or your mobile application. So whatever is added to the cart, if he's clicked a particular banner, if he's browsed a particular page, all of that information becomes part of the events. So when he, let's say, makes a transaction, which is the order that's being placed, the attributes that go along with it would end up including perhaps the category of the product, the value of the order, the items in the cart at that time, and so on. So you have all of these little pieces of data that's available, which will plug into the system, and it has to be stitched together in a fashion that it becomes usable. A very simple abandoned cart use case with a very simple reminder will start to recover a bunch of your carts. And from what I've understood lately, WhatsApp has also become more open and flexible on allowing messaging. So if I came to your website, I saw a bunch of things, I added them to cart, but I did not eventually transact. It's actually going to be very effective if you send me a little WhatsApp reminder at the end of maybe in some cases 1 hour, maybe in some cases 12 hours, maybe in some cases 24 hours, to see that I can come back to the card and close the transaction. And of course, this can also become a sequence wherein the first message does not have an incentive, but maybe the 3rd or the 4th message might have one, because it's a function of how aggressively you want to go after this guy. So maybe for somebody who's a completely new customer, you decide that, okay, I'm going to draw a line at 10% discount. But with somebody who's been a very active customer for a long time and he's now been not come back, then in your attempts to kind of win this guy back or reactivate him, maybe you can go a little more aggressive. So the playbooks for each of these things can be established, and with time, you'll engage with our success team, and Nitya will make sure you get a lot of these inputs.
Ankur, sorry, I had a question here.
Sure.
Would you, do you recommend spanning over 4 weeks to send someone a reminder or a email, web push, just when they, viewed a product and not added to cart?
So that's for an abandoned browse. So what was your question? You recommend spanning over 4 weeks? I said 4 messages. The duration as to how far it goes can be a different one.
No, so the duration is what I'm asking. Does it have to span over 4 weeks?
No, it's a function of the category, right?
Okay.
So if it's an impulse purchase, you'll probably go very intense in the first week itself. You'll send 4 messages that, by the end of the 7th day, he's got a 20% discount.
Yeah.
But if it's not an impulse category, you expect him to engage with it, spend a little more time deciding it's a high value purchase, then you will want to go a little slow. You'll not go very aggressive in the first week itself.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So everybody knows primary key and foreign key. That's just a very simple, I mean, this is more attuned to people who are slightly data oriented, hands-on themselves. Basically, you just have different tables in the system which are connected with each other with, for instance, you have the orders table, which has a customer ID, and you have the customer's profile table, which also has a customer ID. So now I know what males buy from my platform, or if I have to create a segment of all the males who bought a certain pair of shoes for women on the platform, in the case of the ladies' shoes, that's what you'll be able to filter out. So being able to stitch all of these different labels together just helps you improve your ability to segment your audience well, right? So that's where, as a platform, when you start scaling up with us or however you do this components, you will start to see all of these events getting captured extremely well and become actionable. So for instance, somebody who put a filter of size level 6 on your platform, what we've seen very interestingly, and this is back when I was spending all of this effort at Jabong, whenever we would have a certain level of people who bought a certain size, I would send them a personalized email that these are the 6 pairs of shoes which are your size, which are on 70% discount today. All right, and this is a sharp segment because normally across most of these spaces, you will have some products which are slow moving. So it's called cut size in the fashion ecosystem, that you will be left with some non-standard, non-mainstream sizes of inventory which you want to liquidate. And if you were to blast this to the entire audience, it's actually a waste because most people don't have that size. But for that small subset of people who actually have that size excess for a t-shirt or maybe whatever for a shoe, then you will have all those people very interested in coming and transacting. So the conversion funnel looks that much better for these guys. Yeah. So that's why you capture all of this information as events and you start using this information in terms of your communication, automated triggers. It gets interesting. So the important thing, given that you're starting early, it's a great move that you made to be a part of the startup program because the data and the events and the user behavior that you want to capture now, if you don't capture it properly at the moment, then you will have a hard time doing this subsequently. So that's where once you've got your data stack sorted, what is the first nudge, what channels, and what is the message? So triggers is what I normally prefer as the right way to scale up communication. The best part about this is it's automated. Wherein you have a mechanism to send a bunch of messages on their own. So nobody's sitting on an everyday basis to create a certain HTML email, choose a segment and dispatch it to them every day. Because that's what the blast world does. And that's what a lot of people do in terms of their email marketing or WhatsApp marketing efforts. To me, a lot smarter way of doing this will end up being via triggers. And triggers is essentially the reason why you'll send out a communication, right? So on one side, you have user events where as a user, I came to your website or mobile app, I did a few things. So I added something to the cart, I added something to the wish list, I searched something, and I didn't complete that transaction. Then you have the product events wherein you have people who are not people, but essentially business events. And I think this is called relays in our ecosystem. But you'll have situations where something got back in stock, something had a drop in price, something ran low on stock. So you send out a trigger. Now, if you were to combine a user event with a triggered product event, for example, a message that would be sent would look like, you had these 5 items in your cart, which are now running low on stock, or you have this 20% off on this particular item, which is on your cart. Now, the moment, and I would love to use the name of the product in the subject line or the push notification itself, and you can do that by personalization. The kind of conversion rate it draws is actually substantially better than whatever else you send this guy. That's where I would normally encourage people to think of the different triggers they have available on their system and utilize this information to send out the communication to their audience, right? And then, of course, you have the life cycle triggers wherein if you know your interval between 2 orders is 30 days, you want to make sure that you have a certain communication frequency, which is triggered via a journey, which is just linked from a time frame to the first transaction. So if I transacted for the first time today, then 7 days and 15 days and 21 days and so on. That's a life cycle stage trigger. Yeah.
Ankur, I had a question here. Sorry, sure. This is Harsha again.
Yeah.
Ankur, once we set up a CDP, the customer data platform, these can all be automated, right? Once we do the initials.
Yes. Yeah. Is that all the question, Harsh?
That's all.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, a lot of this can be so triggered. The whole point is this being automated. Now I understand a lot of you guys will not necessarily have full-fledged teams to kind of create designs and make all of these manual efforts. That's where Nitya and team will kind of help you with a whole bunch of automated pre-created templates, which can be plugged in. And once you set these things up, they kind of run on autopilot. You will want to do a little bit of optimization here and there, but beyond that, this kind of runs on its own. So there comes the channels. I think the way to describe this would be that you can do a blow horn versus a cacophony versus a symphony. And obviously you would know that I will lean a lot more towards the symphony, which is orchestrated as to how you use each of these things in sync with each other. Now, unless you have a bit of data set up at the background and a system to do an orchestration, you will end up doing one of the blowhorns or the kickoff funnel, which is what most companies do for the most part. But what we encourage you to think about is what is the most appropriate user journey, both from an intensity of channel as well as the intensity of the message content. Indicates as to how badly do you want that guy to be back like right away. And you have to orchestrate that over multiple channels. So for instance, and this is all doable with the journey builder interface that we have. We have a bunch of standard suggestions on kind of journeys you should build. And different businesses will have their own unique outcomes from different experiments. So you have to be open-minded about that. But to the extent the best practices are available, that'll be given to you. Okay. Yeah. So that's where I mean, anecdotally, most people will end up starting to feel that sending too much email is spam, and I don't want to spam because I don't want to be the kind of person who spams. And typically, founders tend to take this all very personally. So that's where I would encourage you to not do that. Of course, if you're sending a blast message to everybody every day, then it's spam, and people will mark you as spam, and people will stop responding or opening your emails. But if you do a good job, you can always make sure that people find your content relevant and interesting. And to me, you're not running a magazine company, which means you'll not have an editorial team to write good quality editorial content every day. You will want to find the personalization route via the user triggers or the product triggers, which keep the frequency at a moderate level and the relevance at a very, very high level. So as long as the message is very personalized to me and very relevant to me, I'm not likely to mark it as spam or feel bad about it. Now, the question is, how do you make that message very relevant and very personalized? That's where the data stack that we built in the past conversation come in. I did mention this before, but I think what effectively would translate into a multi-channel orchestration is where journeys come into the picture. You look at, let's say somebody who abandoned a cart and you choose, okay, I'm only going to communicate in WhatsApp and I'm going to do it over 3 days, right? And what will happen here is you will have somebody who will abandon 2 products in the cart. He'll get a WhatsApp nudge that if you still want to buy it on day 1, or maybe in 30 minutes as well in some cases. For some categories, we've seen that response rate to be the best when it happens the fastest after the abandoned cart. And then it will happen over the next few days, right? And likewise, you'll have more journeys that can happen. So the abandoned cart has a few cousins, which is the abandoned search, for example. I searched something on the platform, but I did not transact. So the intensity wise, the intent of purchase, the cart abandonment is the closest you have, or the failed payment is the one you have, is the closest. Then you have the cart abandonment. Then you have the wish list addition, then you have the search. So these are all reflectors of intent on the part of the user when he wants to buy something. And if you can, and also one more thing below this probably is the browse. So you spend a substantial amount of time looking at a set of products, right? And that's also information you could possibly utilize. So start sending out triggered communications. So you saw this, but you did not buy this. Is that something we can help you with? And shortly we'll be rolling out catalog recommendations as well. So maybe by mid-Jan, you can start using those. And if you were exploring this, but did not buy this, maybe you're interested in these 4 products. That becomes a part of your communication stack as well. Yeah. So when you look at users' ability to engage, not everybody would be available in every channel. Some of it be available on push, on email, some of them be okay on WhatsApp, some of them would not be okay on web push. So you'll have to do a combination of responsiveness as well as over a period understand affinities. So who responds the best on what channel will get established over time, but where is he available today will be available on day 0. So which means that if you were to see that the user is reachable on email or not is a function of whether he's on your subscriber list or not. If he's not reachable on email, then you have to use another channel for this, right? And that's what is a simple filter you can use on your journey creation. Okay. So generally, most people might think of CRM or retention marketing as this one big hack that you will put. It doesn't work like that. It'll end up being a very small bunch of, a large bunch of small interventions you'll make, which is essentially the growth loops as we call it, right? And once you have these 10 kinds of email going on a daily basis or 10 kinds of notifications going on a daily basis, you'll start to optimize them for each of the levels of the funnel or levels of the metric. So how do you improve the open rates? How do you improve the click-through rates? Or how do you improve the conversion rates from there? And you keep making those little nudges at every step. At the end of it, the compounding effect you get becomes amazing, right? And that's the point of automated trigger-based journeys, because otherwise what you tend to get busy with is drafting this new fancy-looking email or fancy-looking subject line every day, and that takes away most of your attention. So how do you learn as a system? How do you optimize? How do you get better over time? How do you get the compounding effect? It'll work a lot better when you have these automated trigger-based affairs and you keep optimizing them one at a time going forward. Yeah. And that's where what I love to see or showcase as an image for a retention marketer is actually an orchestra where a whole lot of things are happening in parallel. A mature setup would have 100 growth loops running. Early setup would probably have 10, but each of these are contributing meaningfully to a larger play. And you'll mature each of these with time. So by the end of it, you have a lot of these running, and each of them is doing well. Okay, I have more topics to cover, so maybe I can take a quick 1 minute breather if you have questions to ask. We have, I think, another 6 or 7 slides to go through, and we have another 15 minutes of time. I can extend a little bit if people have questions, but that's where we are. Do you have any questions, anybody? Okay, no questions.
So I have a question. Ankur, this is Harsh again. I have a question. Ankur, WhatsApp has become a favorite medium these days, but what's the suggested frequency for WhatsApp? Because yes, it gives very good open rates, but it's also quickly approaching spam level of recognition with consumers, right?
Absolutely. So hence you want to make sure that your messaging is completely on point. And if it's triggered abandoned cart messaging, it's a triggered thing, so that you don't necessarily control frequency. But promotional messaging is anywhere still restricted on WhatsApp, so you can't go overboard as of now. With time, it will get more opened up, and that's where the relevance of the message is the big part of the focus. So I remember with people doing flash sales twice a day, they were doing twice a day kind of communications. But for people who don't have that kind of let's say delta or change or a reason to engage, if you go overboard, it will become spammy. So there's no perfect answer. In your case, if you're talking about purely honey as a segment, then probably once a week is enough to give you the brand recall that this brand exists and I like this guy. But beyond that, will just probably not give you results. So any kind of user behavior that he's come to my website, then you want to follow up, do it on the next day itself, if he's not transacted. But anything else which is more of promotional in nature will have to be more controlled. So the more you can move all of your communication to triggered base, the easier it gets. Right? And automatically when you set up a journey, you'll say, okay, after this 7 days later, do this, or 3 days later, do this. And when you're doing this, you're not no more worried about sending out a blast communication, because that would not really control who saw what last. That will go to everybody on the same day and the same time, which does not result in great value. So what I normally suggest we do is let all the triggered communication go out. After that, if there's an audience left, then you do more generic basic communication, because you may not have any information about that guy to trigger something with. Yeah.
Understood. Thanks.
So in my deck here, I had a picture of Alia and Amitabh simply because this looks a lot more personal. And I think Tina was working this deck. She wanted this to be more serious. But the idea here is when you're talking to two different people, you're talking to different messages. You don't talk the same thing. And unfortunately, I would think it's unfortunate. Most brands end up doing the same thing to their customers. They'll say the same thing to everybody. Now, it's a function of a degree of maturity of mindsets as well as maturity of infrastructure available, because to me, a one-to-one communication is entirely possible now. And you should utilize that information and make one-to-one communication, because otherwise you're leaving money on the table in some fashion, or you're becoming irrelevant for the customer. So the image I would probably have here is of a guy who's watching TV, and I'm guessing you have about 35 people or 32 people here. Some of you would have different tabs and different screens open. You would be listening to me while you're looking at something else. Unless I'm saying something which is really interesting and really relevant for you entirely. So when this question was being answered, of course, he would listen to me. Remaining 31 people may not. Right. So that's where the personalization comes in super handy, that if you're giving me something very relevant to me, I'll absorb it and I'll respond to it. If you're giving me something generic, I'm going to flip to the next message. Yeah. So that's where the idea of dynamic micro segments come in. It's very related to the idea of triggers. So if you look at the shoes example, the dynamic micro segment would probably mean the first pair of shoes were bought yesterday. So what happens with dynamic micro segments is people who will enter the segment today will leave the segment tomorrow. So there's always going to be a new audience a part of here, right? So this is a trigger, and you set up a daily recurring campaign. It will mean that it'll just go to those people who entered this segment yesterday, and it will not go to them again, which means every day there'll be a new bunch of people who are getting this message, and that's it. Right now, of course, you could make it a multi-step journey as well, but the idea here was to highlight the need or a clarity of the micro segments. Right, you could do different kind of journeys for different categories that have been bought, or whether it's a first-time order. So people who bought their first pair of shoes, but they've been buying other stuff from us before. So their overall frequency is 10, but for the first time they bought shoes. Now I want to send them to a specific nurture campaign to get them to buy stocks from me. for all I know. So there's all of these little things you can do, which will have incremental impact. Now, of course, you want to make sure that you do the larger bucket items first and then come to the smaller niche or smaller specific inputs. Yeah. Now, it's a common myth. Most people would love to do a lot of segmentation, but very quickly you'll realize that, okay, I broke the country down into male and female. Okay, then I broke them down into age brackets. There are 5 different age brackets between, let's say, 18 to 25, 25 to 35, 35 to 45, and so on. So now you have male, female age bracket, and now you have probably a geographic split, north, east, south, west. So between all of these, you now have 20 odd segments created, right? 2 into 5 into 2, or 2 into 5 into 4 is 40 segments created. Now that can be a nightmare to handle from a marketer's point of view, because you won't know what to do with it. How do you create a meaningful communication to these 40 people on an everyday basis? It won't work. So you'll end up in a fatigue where you'll end up sending out the same thing to everybody. What I propose to do a little differently is where, instead of creating all these segments, you create a personalization layer on this. So what will happen is, in the abandoned cart example, of course, it's already one-to-one personalized. But for an email, for an example, if you were to make this into a modular content, like you have a header, you have a key visual, you have a body, and you have a footer. Now, each of these components can, of course, be broken. Let's say you have one header, you can always have a header, subheader, which is beneath that. You can have the header, which is determined by a certain variable. So if he's male, then you have a visual 1 or visual 2. If he's a guy who always buys new arrivals, vis-a-vis a guy who always buys high on discount, you automatically change the visual, the subheader visual, and so on and so forth. So what will happen is, each of these become a permutation and combination of several components, right? Each of these emails that are going out, which ultimately translate into millions of combinations. So you could jolly well claim that you're doing personalization one-to-one communication. As a very simple idea here itself, each of your emails could actually have the last abandoned cart information as part of that email, right? If he's sending him 10 emails, each of these emails still utilizes the fact that he still has something in his cart. You put that reminder in that email. Of course, that user will not open every email. He'll open probably 1, 2, 3 of them. And if he gets a reminder of that cart, he might convert. So adding all these different personalized elements will automatically improve your click-through rate for your emails. And you can apply this similar thinking to other messages also, except other channels will not give you that liberty to have 5 or 6 components to it. So you'll have to just make sure that you're using personalization very well instead of going too far with segmentation. Yeah. So this is an example I thought I'd love to give. It's the playbook that a lot of companies could utilize very well, and in fact build this out from scratch at Foodpanda when I was leading global CRM. This was back in 2014-15 when Foodpanda was still running a very, very massive 45-country operation. So if you look at the messages on the left, which is from Zomato and Swiggy, these are messages which are blast messages. It's the same message that's gone to nearly everybody on their audience. Now, I don't know, for some reason, if they believe I would respond better to Magic, so they send me this, but I would imagine this is the same message that went to everybody. And that's what is a little unfortunate, because both Swiggy and Zomato know insane amount of information about when I eat, what kind of cuisine I like, what kind of restaurants I'm happy to try when they're new. And the message could actually be a lot richer. And I would give it 30 seconds for you to read through the message. The items in those brackets, so to speak, are the personalized elements. So those are things inserted because it's me. Yeah, the paneer tikka could also be in that dabba. So imagine the response rate to the message on the left versus the message on the right. Does anybody here feel that they'll respond better to the first message versus the second message? Happy to debate this. But I mean, from our understanding and from our data setup that we have seen, this has a substantial impact on the click-throughs. And obviously, you have to match it with the landing page and the deep link inside the application. But beyond that, this would definitely result in better results. Okay. Should we? This is where you will see examples from the web homepage. Amazon, Netflix have kind of spoiled their users to a certain level. It's a fun fact that a marketing team wanted to use that people want personalized experiences. I think the word is not want as much as the word is people expect personalized experiences, because it's not something that you consciously notice that somebody is doing this or somebody is not, and you kind of judge them for that he's not offering me personalized experience, so I'm not going to come to him. It's the same thing with the attention span. He's offering me something. I'm going to give it 20 seconds. If it's really relevant for me, I'm going to pay more attention. Otherwise, I'm going to bounce. I'm going to move on. Hence, the whole need to personalize my homepage and my experience becomes very, very relevant. So that's what Amazon and Netflix seem to be doing extremely well. And I mean, a Facebook or a Twitter automatically has a very, very personalized feed because it's a function of who are my friends and who am I following. right? That's where to do this meaningfully can become very, very powerful. One of the other angles to the same thing is your emails and your push notifications will ultimately have a certain open rate. After the point, your WhatsApp, if you overuse it, will start to saturate as well. But 100% of your traffic comes to your website or your mobile application, right? And if you were to utilize this piece of real estate extremely well, for at this point, what you do on your homepage is the guy who's coming back for the fifth time and who's already a loyal customer to you, vis-a-vis a completely new guy who's coming for the first time, you show him nearly the same website experience. Now that's a little odd, right? And that's where you could utilize the web personalization playbook that we have to do this much better, as to what are the different components you can personalize, what are the elements you could plug in which are personalized, right? So could it be my recent orders? Could it be my item in my wish list? Could it be my preferred categories? It could be a lot of these things. And that's what you could leverage very well. Yeah. Okay. So the whole idea is to make sure that you do all of these little things which come together and give you a very, very valuable impact in your cohorts. That's that. So if you have any questions, I'm happily accessible on LinkedIn. We can do another session on this as well. But this is where my deck ends.
Ankur, there is one question from Ashish. So Ashish is founder at Postcard. This is a Indian snacking brand, and the question is that this is an impulse brand and sort of impulse category and a lot of seasonal products. So how do you define the lifetime? Because there are sort of 12 cycles he's mentioning, which is depending on seasons and months, there are different categories of foods and flavors which are there.
Sure.
So how do you define the lifetime in that sort of category? And Ashish,
you would ideally want it to be perpetual, right? So see, typically what happens is if you have an interval of, let's say, 1 month between purchases, I'm going to give you a slightly generic example so it's applicable to everyone. By the way, if you guys can all have your cameras on, it just makes it a little more lively for me. So if you have these 1 month as a typical time frame for a reorder, and this guy is now already at 3 months and he's not ordered, you can define that as a multiple. That typical interval is X, 3X of that time gone by, he's not placed an order, that's considered a churn. So at what point of time is a large bunch of users churning is what you would start to see as your typical lifetime. Does that answer the question, Ashish? Because if you're a multi-seasonal, multi-product, you would want to make sure that you're not selling December ka products in April. It won't work. So as long as you have a portfolio which is relevant for April, people should come back and convert. So the lifetime could jolly well be 12 months or maybe even more. Because if you're able to cross-sell them into every month a new category, that would work better.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much. Sorry.
And this has to be a multi-channel approach, because what tends to happen is you start to look at it purely from an email or SMS perspective. The open rates of these channels will ultimately be a certain finite number. They'll probably be what, I think 10, 15, 20, 25% in a good scenario. So if you were to start utilizing that across your Google ads, across your Facebook ads, is where this starts to get more interesting. So it's a feature that we have, which is yet to become really actively used by a lot of companies, but we're happy to support you with the learning curve and experiences so that you can maximize the omni-channel play here.
Ankur, one question, Rishit here. I run a brand called Eat Anytime. So okay. I was very sort of able to connect with the first slide where you say that the journey has been 4 months. And when I start looking at my data, it's been almost similar.
Sure.
How do you, at what stage do you suggest is we move those category of consumers to do not reach or reach once in a year kind of a, because what I've realized is each time when there's pressure on sales, we keep bombarding, or sometimes we overdo in terms of reach out to consumers who've not responded in the first 5 months, right? So what's the ideal time there?
So normally 180 days is like the cutoff time. If nobody's responded to an opened an email in 6 months, you should leave them out. And this should be an open engagement behavior based, not transaction based. Because somebody might have transacted you from in January, they might still be opening occasionally your emails in March, April, and May. So don't disconnect with them. So disconnection should happen on the basis of email engagement or channel engagement than transaction history.
Got it. But then when we start looking at conversions, okay, so it's a sort of vicious cycle, right? So what's happening is, if say example somebody's actually transacted and then they've not transacted for 6 months, and if I'm still trying to send out a message to him, and when I try to sort of look at a conversion either in terms of open or maybe what's the sell through or throughput, it becomes a little skewed because then you're trying to reach out to a larger audience which is not any which is interested for the last 6 months.
Of course, that's where. So normally it's a good idea to split this out, right? So when you're sending a campaign to this audience, have a separate funnel for it. Because what tends to happen is when you blend the entire audience and send a single dispatch, your open rate starts to look a little misleading. The moment you have an overload of old customers, your open rates will go down. So normally we recommend, or at least in my experience, what we've seen more valuable is have the 30-day openers as your active base, which you engage with the most frequent basis, the people who opened at least one email in the last 30 days. So you have the highest frequency of communication with these guys. And this is an email. Of course, you could apply similar heuristics to other channels. For people who have not opened a single email in the last 30 days as well, you reduce the frequency. For people who have not opened a single email in the last 180 days, now you like probably once a week kind of communication, and that too should be throttled a bit. So you split this audience into 4 groups and send some every day, because you start to hurt your IP reputation and everything also if you overdo the 180 day plus audience.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep. Okay. What else? So by the way, we've reached the end of our time. So whoever wants to leave is okay to leave. You don't have to stay back just by being polite. I'm happy to be here for more couple of minutes if you have questions. But beyond that, we'd be available and accessible on our WhatsApp as well as other channels. So welcome to ask any questions whatsoever on this space. So to the extent we can support you, help you, we'd be very glad to do that. And this, by the way, means a little bit of beyond retention topics as well.
Yeah,
so that we're doing a hey.
Yeah, one small question. So suppose we are launching, currently we are launching some deals in the app. So in order for the customers, should we make the promotion initially, or we let it be a little bit organic so that it will reach to more people? Or we should go initially, if we launch a deal, should we go for direct promotion that this is something coming up in the store? Or so what's your advice on that?
So to the extent you can make it targeted. So if it's a store-based thing, is your entire audience everywhere, each deal be available to everybody?
Yeah.
So in which case, normally you could just do a triggered messaging, new deal on the platform, and that goes to all the audience. And over time, you will see that who are the people responding to it the best, and some people are not responding to it. Then you sharpen the audience to say that, okay, whoever is interested in deals is the one who gets deals. So there's no problem with amplifying the right messaging. The only challenge that happens is when you start to amplify irrelevant messages.
Cool. Thanks.
Ankur, we have a quick question from Rahul as well. What is an average open rate and conversion rate for an email campaign?
So it's a complicated question, because if you've chosen the entire audience that you have, then it's a function of how old is your business. A lot of people would have a very large base of people who have not opened a single email in 180 days. Assuming you're all young businesses, I would assume that you will not have very old audiences, which are kind of dead audience. So at the segment level of 30-day openers, what I've seen to be a good open rate is between 25 to 30%. That's the open rate. And a good category, let's say a fashion category, which has a lot of engaging content in there, will have a click-through open ratio of between 35 to 45%. So click-to-open ratio is a ratio I recommend we measure because you have the open and then you have the click rate. But in between, the quality of the email content will reflect in the CTOR, which is what you should look at. So if you have a 25 to 30% open rate, a 30% CTOR, it will translate into about 10% to 12% click-through rate, which is the best in class. But if you're blending the entire audience together, then your open rates would come down to something like 10%. Your CTOR would look like 25%. So in effect, you will be at 3% to 4% click-through rate. If you're doing poorer than this, then you're doing something wrong. You should revise. And we do have some benchmark reports internally. I'm sure we'll share it industry-wise as you go along in your journey with the startup program. What else? Okay, if there are no more questions, then we'll leave it open to the next round of conversations. I think 23rd is when we have a session. I think the D2C brands will probably enjoy that well. I've got Shrikar, who's the head of seller advertising on Amazon, and I've had pretty interesting inputs from him and insights from him on what D2C brands should do and they should not do. And we'll dig deeper into all of this on the 23rd in a session with Shrikar. So if you've not already signed up, do that. And yeah, I look forward to having a lot of you guys in the next session and the conversations. Yeah. Thank you so much. You have my WhatsApp and LinkedIn. Let's be in touch. All the best, guys.